Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble!
Detective J. Warner Wallace has built an extensive Christian ministry on the foundation of his career as a police homicide detective. He claims that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are so similar to the actual testimony of eyewitnesses that they provide credible evidence to the miracles and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Well, I too am a retired police sergeant. I've interviewed thousands of witnesses just like Detective Wallace has, and I'm going to show why he's wrong. That's the topic for today's briefing training. Let's take a look at some of the very common things that Detective Wallace has said throughout his career.
Because if you've ever worked with witnesses, you know one rule of witnesses. They never, ever agree. Ever. It could happen 5 minutes ago. Someone could come up here, and I used to run an experiment in front of my youth group. Someone would run up, slap me on the side of the head, and run off the stage. And I would ask everyone on a card, don't talk to each other, just tell me, what did you just see? You wouldn't believe the variation between the accounts. They just saw it together. We were all together. They couldn't even agree on the sex of the perpetrator. Think about that.
Any competent police detective would be suspicious if reports of multiple witnesses had their testimony in extensive word-to-word phrases. They would be further suspicious if the chronological order of those reports was consistently documented in the exact same order. The reports would be suspicious not because they conflict with one another, but because they were too similar to one another. Witnesses do not provide their testimony to the events that they have seen, heard, or felt in exact word-for-word phrases in an extensive way. And they don't provide their testimony with the fact patterns listed out in the same chronological order. That would be suspicious because it's not the way that witnesses testify or provide what they saw. Evidence within the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, called the Synoptic Gospels because of their striking similarities, indicates that these authors are not independently recording witness statements. What it does indicate is they are literally copying from each other's scrolls. One author having the other author's scroll right in front of him and copying it down, sometimes changing the sentence structure just slightly and other times adding modifications of their own. Any college professor who receives 3 student papers with the striking similarities of the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke would immediately suspect plagiarism and would accuse their students of cheating. Let's take a look at the actual evidence. I'm going to use the famous story of Jesus feeds the 5,000 to demonstrate how the gospel narratives are suspiciously similar to one another and how Detective Wallace's investigation is deficient. The feeding of the 5,000 appears in the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. It's a very short story, taking only a few paragraphs. As we look and compare between Mark and Matthew's Gospel, we do see some word-for-word phrases that are shared between both of those short stories. Here's the story in Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel. Everything highlighted in red is word for word the same between those two Gospels. Having that much word for word phrasing in such a short story is suspicious. If we compare the Gospel of Mark to the Gospel of Luke, we're going to see a lot of word for word phrases when we compare Mark's Gospel to Luke's Gospel. However, the phrases are different than the ones we saw when we compared Mark's Gospel to Matthew's Gospel. Even though they're different, there's a lot of word-for-word phrases the same between Mark and Luke's Gospel for such a short story. Then if we compare Matthew to Luke, we again see word-for-word phrases that appear in Matthew and also appear in Luke, quite extensively for such a short story. Additionally, if you put this video on pause and study the chronological order as the fact patterns are presented in each different gospel, you're going to see something very suspicious. Although it's not exact all the time, the fact patterns are so similar to one another that it becomes suspicious and an indication somebody is copying somebody. And when we compare all three gospel narratives to one another simultaneously, we still find that they do share some word-for-word similarities, including some extensive phrasing that is in all three of those gospels. This is not how witnesses report events that happened. They don't use word-for-word phrases like the gospel authors did use. Now, you certainly don't need to take my word for it on something that gets flashed on a computer screen really quickly. All you need to do is find any story that appears in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, or Luke and print those out on a piece of paper. Get yourself a yellow highlighter pen and just highlight everything you find that is word for word from one story to another. You will quickly discover that an awful lot of the word for word phrasing is there. In addition, you're going to find that there's just slight modifications to some of the same sentences. In other words, the sentence is exactly the same from one gospel to the next. It's just a word or two has been moved around to make it appear that it's a different sentence. You can do this experiment yourself. I'm not suggesting the feeding of the 5,000 happened at all. The whole story just smacks of legend. What probably did happen was Jesus was evangelizing crowds of people with charismatic sermons. Afterwards, people would break up into groups and have something to eat while they talked about the sermon, just like they do in Christian churches today. This created an oral tradition in where Jesus was miraculously feeding more and more people with smaller and smaller rations. Legends are incredibly common. Miraculously feeding 5,000 people is not. Let's take a look at a quick video clip of Detective Wallace and Christian author Lee Strobel in a perfectly choreographed conversation designed to wow the sheeple of their Christian audience. It's priestcraft at its finest.
And the fact that these were unplanned, apparently. I mean, they fit together.
Yes.
In an unintentional way.
So, for example, why is it at the feeding of 5,000, I think Jesus asks Philip, where can we go to feed these people? You know, Philip is a minor character in the Gospels. Jesus never asks Philip for anything. He's going to ask Simon, right? He's going to ask somebody. He's not going to, his top three. He's not going to ask Philip. Who the heck is Philip? You never get from that account why it is he would ask Philip until you read the other accounts and realize they're in Bithynia, where Philip was raised. The one person who could actually answer that question would be Philip.
Is Jesus asking Philip really that impressive? The conversation that Detective Wallace is having with Lee Strobel is based on the scholarly work of Lydia and Timothy McGrew, and it's become somewhat of this legendary oral tradition within Christian apologetics. They all talk about it constantly. But what is happening is that Jesus has just finished a sermon somewhere in the area of Bethsaida. There's a large group of people there, and Jesus wants to give them something to eat. But the apostles can only find a small boy who's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It's simply not enough people to feed all the people that are there. So Jesus turns to Philip and says, hey, where can somebody get some food around here? Why is Detective Wallace so impressed with Jesus asking Philip? Because Philip is from Bethsaida, and he would be the person that would be most knowledgeable about where you could get food in that area. It's a small peripheral fact which turns out to be accurate. Law enforcement training and science-based interviewing does support the McGrew's overall thesis. If a witness is getting small, unintentional facts correct, that does enhance the overall likelihood that their statement is accurate. The McGrew's work is very scholarly, it cannot be summarily dismissed, and it must be taken seriously. If witnesses agreeing on small details in a story increase overall accuracy, do errors in the same story compromise overall accuracy? There is a long recognized editorial fatigue error in Luke's Gospel in reference to this exact story. Also, Detective Wallace fails to mention other facts that are very important to this story. All anyone has to do is read John's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 1 through 15, and the additional facts are depicted right there. First of all, Jesus has no interest in finding food in that area. He already knows that he's going to miraculously feed the 5,000 people. His motivations for asking Philip about this are clearly stated in John's Gospel. He is testing Philip. He is not trying to find where food can be found. It happens to be a test that Philip does not pass. Additionally, Detective Wallace makes this very odd statement about why Jesus asked Philip. Philip is a totally unimportant apostle. Simon was right there. Why didn't he ask Simon? Simon is a very important apostle. Why does Detective Wallace make this kind of odd statement? Well, it's a very good thing that Detective Wallace was not on the witness stand in court when he made that statement, because a defense attorney would have immediately asked him, "Excuse me, Detective Wallace, where is Simon's hometown?" It just happens to be Bethsaida as well. In the exact same passage in John's Gospel, chapter 1, that depicts Philip from being from Bethsaida, also depicts Simon from being from Bethsaida, as well as Andrew. Detective Wallace did not seem to be familiar with the exact facts of the caper that he was talking about. We need to have a Simon challenge here. Detective Wallace uses the name Simon when he's referring to the Apostle Simon. So I use the name Simon, although it's not the name that I would normally use. Do you know your New Testament enough to know that Simon actually has 4 names? When God was inspiring people to write these Gospels, he clearly did not want to make it simple and understandable. The names are totally convoluted. If you can put down in the comments section what Simon's 4 names are in the New Testament, I will put a love emoji on your comment. So what is this editorial fatigue error about what you speak? Well, if you're an author and you're copying a long scroll sometime in the 1st century, that's a very difficult, arduous task to do. You might become tired during that very long process and you make mistakes because you're fatigued. Editorial fatigue. What happens in Matthew and Mark's Gospel, the location of the feeding of 5,000 is determined to be a remote place. And after the feeding of 5,000 in Mark and Matthew's Gospel, the apostles get into a boat and go to the town of Bethsaida. You have the feeding take place, the apostles go by boat to the town of Bethsaida. However, in Luke's Gospel, Luke writes that the feeding of 5,000 took place in the town of Bethsaida, and then just a few words later he writes in a remote place. It's long been theorized that Luke simply was tired and called the town of Bethsaida a remote place, when in reality the town of Bethsaida is not a remote place. First of all, when translated into modern English, Bethsaida literally means house of fishermen. Additionally, 3 of Jesus' apostles are from the town of Bethsaida, already mentioned. Philip, Simon, and Andrew are all from Bethsaida. A little bit more evidence that it's just not some remote place. Additionally, in Mark's Gospel, there's a significant population documented as living in Bethsaida. And in Matthew's Gospel, the population of Bethsaida is said to be unrepentant. All of these things lead one to believe that as far as the New Testament is concerned, Bethsaida is not a remote place, but actually a place where people live, and there's a fishing industry there. I suspect Detective Wallace would immediately discount my whole entire argument. He would say, look it, the stories indicate that the feeding of 5,000 took place somewhere near Bethsaida in a remote area or place, and that my insistence on the details of the location is simply sergeant nitpicking. But if Detective Wallace is going to be impressed by minutia that comes out to be accurate, should he not be equally unimpressed by minutia that is mistaken or plagiarized? As a former police detective and detective supervisor, I'm familiar with confirmation bias. There were many times I was investigating a case and thought that I had a very excellent case against a suspect. Then a piece of evidence would come in that compromised my case, and it's upsetting. When I watch Detective Wallace's videos, it's obvious to me that he is suffering from confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. As soon as Detective Wallace hears something that is in conflict with his belief that the New Testament Gospels are accurate history, he immediately dismisses it and comes up with an excuse why that piece of information is not important. Cognitive dissonance is the idea that when you hear something that is in conflict with your long-standing important beliefs, that it actually causes you anxiety and pain, and you want to get rid of that pain. It's a very human nature. So you come up with some story that alleviates that pain that you're feeling, and you grasp onto that as if it's truth. You can literally see this in Detective Wallace's videos.
You know, the differences that you mentioned, though, between variations and eyewitnesses, that can work between, let's say, the Synoptics and John, or Mark and John. But that doesn't work so well when we're looking at differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When I did my 8-year focused study on gospel differences, at the end, what really impresses you are not the differences, but the similarities with the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Because the way I'd explain it is this. If, let's say, the 5 of us are at a restaurant and we're having dinner, and we notice a couple at the table next to us and they're having an argument, and we're watching that argument intensify over the course of 10 minutes, and finally the couple stand up and they're yelling at each other, and the woman takes a wine bottle and breaks it across the guy's cheek, and just then the paramedics, the police come, they arrest the women, take her off in cuffs, the paramedics work on the guy's face. Police officer comes over and asks the 5 of us at that moment to report, write down independently what we saw and what we heard. Like you say, there's going to be variation in eyewitness testimony. There's going to be a lot of similarities, there's going to be a lot of differences. Now, if the police officer gets those back and he looks and sees there's virtually verbatim, word for word in many of those instances, that police officer is going to be suspicious that there was collusion involved, collaboration involved. But there's more. That couple was arguing in Spanish. Now, fortunately, we're all fluent in Spanish, but the police officer is not. So the police officer asks us to translate that into English. Now, anyone who's remotely familiar with another language knows that there's no one-on-one correspondence in translations. And even you'll translate something differently tomorrow than you translated today. But when they get it back and they see that there's still a one-to-one correspondence in many cases, word for word, in our translation of what was said and done, the police officer all the more is going to be suspicious that we have colluded with one another. But there's still more. Because it's not just 20 minutes later that we're doing this, it's 30, 40 or more years later that we're recalling those things, word for word translated. Now, the police officer is rightly going to know that we worked with one another on this. With the Gospels, you've got Jesus mainly speaking in Aramaic. It's been translated into Greek. It's almost word for word, and they're reporting a minimum of 20 years later. So whereas you could have that independent testimony between John and, let's say, Mark, it's going to be more difficult to establish that between Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay, so you're saying, like, as a police officer, well, I'm going to give you as a police officer because I happen to be a police officer. So I'm just saying, if I was to take a crime that occurred last week, and it was a 20-minute thing, and so you each write 10 pages on what happened, and I don't tell you that and I present it to you instead as an ancient document, you will see all the things that we try to harmonize, or explain away through genre, you will see in the event from just last week. I think what you're wondering is, can I have any confidence that that event actually occurred? And that I can reconstruct the event reasonably given the data? And my fear is that if we aren't careful, that we could find the cases I'm working, if I gave those to you and told you they were 3,000 years old, you would be tempted to figure out how to explain the differences by way of some genre or anything else, because they are hard to reconcile. There will be places where they agree word for word. I don't think that necessarily, one of two things happen. They either made it up together, those pieces word for word, but they're sprinkled along the way with differences, but some things are similar. I'm also could be that they just happen to hear those things accurately, and they represented them accurately. So my thinking on it is a question you probably all have is, can we trust that what we have are 4 documents that are even reconcilable, or that we have to kind of guess where authors took liberty with the facts
When Detective Wallace published Cold Case Christianity, there is plenty of evidence that he was aware of the synoptic problem and somewhat contradicts his normal commentary of witnesses never ever agree. On page 83 of Detective Wallace's book, he writes this: some aspect of each witness's statement may be completely identical. This is particularly true when witnesses describe aspects of the crime that were dramatic or important to the sequence of events. It is also true when later witnesses are aware of what other witnesses have offered and simply affirm the prior description by telling me the rest occurred just the way he said. This quote is absurd. I have trouble even believing that a homicide detective wrote that. No homicide detective would take a witness statement that the rest occurred just the way he said. A homicide detective would tell the witness, look it, we have to get your statement from you. Your words from start to finish, not the words of some guy over there. Witnesses do use identical statements for small, important events. An infield lineup which identifies a suspect would be a common example. It's very routine for police officers to take a witness over to where a suspect is detained. The witness looks at that suspect and says things like, oh, that's him, or that's the guy for sure. Those are very common witness statements that a police officer would hear over and over again. That is not what's going on in the synoptic gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Detective Wallace usually uses an argument to cover the similarities of the synoptic gospels that they come from oral traditions. Oral traditions are ripe for exaggeration. Somebody hears something and wants to make the story a little bit better than when they heard it, so they exaggerate slightly and add facts to the story that were not originally there. This is the exact way we come up with legendary tales. Let's take a look at some of Detective Wallace's comments.
Now, let's say, for example, you found a set of documents that you could know with certainty were like a Q. They would say, oh, the Gospels are written from a common document that was used prior called the Q doc. I don't think that's the case. I think Q is simply the oral tradition. It's the tradition of people who said it the same way for 20 years and then wrote it down.
In the New Testament, Matthew and Luke both write about the narrative scene of Jesus' birth and nativity. Those stories are very different. So in some cases, Matthew and Luke could be using an oral tradition, but in other cases of a very important event, Jesus' birth, they're using completely different stories to describe what happened. Additionally, oral traditions are not particularly trustworthy. I'm going to use the famous story of Adam and Eve to demonstrate how oral traditions make mistakes. The American oral tradition for Adam and Eve's story is God created everything, the universe and mankind, and then created Adam and Eve in this perfect marriage of man and woman to become husband and wife. And then they populated the world and sinned in the Garden of Eden, thus letting sin into the world. That's the American oral tradition of the story of Adam and Eve. It does not match what the Bible says about the story of Adam and Eve. First of all, God creates the universe and then he creates Adam. And he says to Adam, hey, it's not good that you should be alone. I'm going to make you a helpmate. Then God creates the animal kingdom and brings each animal to Adam, one animal at a time, and Adam names those animals. And after this procedure is completed, there's no suitable helper found for Adam. God then, after Adam rejects all the animals from the animal kingdom, God makes Eve. When Adam wakes up from his deep sleep and Eve is presented to him, it's Adam that approves of Eve. God says nothing about it at all. It really appears that God's plan was for Adam to have a helpmate from the animal kingdom, and Eve was plan B. How does this situation then work out? Well, Adam and Eve become married, they have sex, and they have children. One of their sons murders their other son, and a few turns of the biblical page of Genesis later, God becomes so upset with humankind that he's sorry he created them in the first place, so he drowns them. That's the Genesis story of Adam and Eve. Detective Wallace has never publicly debated anyone in the decades of his Christian ministry. He only speaks in front of Christian audiences and with his fellow Christian apologists, and generally answers only pre-selected questions. He simply has never put his arguments to the test in the arena of public debate. Detective Wallace remains the critic in the stands. I've reached out to Detective Wallace on multiple occasions asking for a public debate about the truthfulness of the New Testament. So far, I have received no response. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8 has frequently been an inspiration to military and law enforcement personnel and reads, "Then I heard the voice of the Lord asking, 'Whom should I send? Who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here I am, Lord, send me.'" This verse represents military and law enforcement personnel's willingness to go where other people are not willing to go at all. But for Detective Wallace, Isaiah 6:8 really represents, "Lord, send someone else." That's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and stay safe.